Hey, everybody. Welcome to American Literature. This is a spring 2021 course offered at Tennessee Tech University, required general education humanities requirements. So we got a bunch of non-English majors who just sort of stumbled into this room having no idea what they were going to get their hands on. My name is Andrew William Smith, teacher on the radio, instructor of English here at Tennessee Tech. And today I'm dropping a new talk, which I'm really super excited about song hunting. And so one of the things that's changed over time is the medium by which we listen to music. And first of all, we have to understand that music is part of the American story. And so music is part of literature. Popular music is a literature unto itself. And in some universities, you're going to have a really great music studies department. We have a great music department, but it's music instrument and music instruction as much as it is music studies. You do have to take a music appreciation course, which might bump up against some of my material, but you have fields like ethnomusicology and other fields of pop music studies that are landing in music departments. But increasingly, you're finding the study of rock and roll is going to land in what's called an American Studies department, which we don't have here at Tech, or in an English department. So I stand in a rich lineage, and there'll be some more discussion of how this is situated as literary studies. I say that for my own sake as the professor, but I've never had a student complain about how much rock and roll and film and pop music and hip hop and country and all of the genres of popular music that we study in this course, which has been intersecting with the rock and roll story for many seasons now in my 2130 curriculum. So I want to say something to you all about the medium by which you listen to music. So you listen to music today primarily with what device? Many of you listen to music primarily on your phones. If you're not a DJ or a collector yourself, you almost for sure listen to music on your telephone. That is your jukebox. Just a few years ago, you were listening to music primarily on an MP3 player, an iPod, or another off-brand MP3 player that wasn't part of the Apple kind of branding of music. You remember iTunes was what everybody did, and then it became Apple Music. Now, a lot of people also do Spotify. They do YouTube Music, Amazon Music. There are many streaming boutique platforms that you can subscribe to for a very nominal fee. And remember, that money goes, at least trickles down to the artist. So that's why you pay your $10 a month, is so pennies can go to artists. You're not just throwing that money away or giving it to the corporate overlords, though the corporate overlords are going to get some of that cheddar. You're going to give some to the artists as well. So that in your lifetimes has been the change in the music industry, right? So at the beginning of the century, we were still primarily listening to music on compact disc. And compact disc, that was a short generation, mid 80s to the early zeros, before digital streaming became the main way to listen to music. So there was the compact disc period. And before that, there was the cassette period and the vinyl LP period. In there was a reel-to-reel movement, reel-to-reel tape recording, 8-track tapes like that. And so everybody always, and maybe you listen also on your laptop and on your TV, and maybe your desktop computer is also a music jukebox recording studio type vibe as well. But digital is the way that we are going today, though there has been a humongous revival in the collecting of vinyl albums. I've got a ginormous collection, probably numbering in the thousands, not fully cataloged, partially cataloged on a great vinyl cataloging website called Discogs. If you are getting into the vinyl habit, maybe you learned it from your dad, maybe you're a hipster. I've seen a lot of young people learning to start to collect their own. Definitely, you need to know about Discogs. It's a place where you can buy records, learn about records, and keep a nice database of your collection. Again, mine is only partially put together up there. But if you go back to the beginning of the commercial record business, which is about in the 20s, basically, the 1920s, the roaring 20s, 100 years ago, good time to talk about the 20s now that we're in the 20s. People were listening to 78. 78s were two sides. And you see an actual 78 on an actual 78 player. That photo is not off of Wikipedia. That photo is not off of some archive. I took that photo yesterday in Cookeville at my friend's workshop on his actual Victrola player, hand crank manual, no electricity recorder. And there's two sides of a shellac 78 record there. So 78s became wildly popular in the 20s and 30s. And then what happened was the Great Depression, and the recording industry started to go downhill. And then also what happened is World War II happened, and some of the shellac was actually destroyed and repurposed for different materials. And the shellac actually comes from like a resin that's made by like a bug or something. You like get this goo out of a tree or something. I've read like so many articles about what the shellac is, and I still, like, in my mind, it's still having a hard, you guys are dealing in gigabytes, and microchips today, but back in the day, they had some bug goo that they turned into music, right? So, and the recording device actually looked like a record player. It was like a reverse record player, and you scratched onto a master disc, and the recording device was humongous, and you had to carry it around with you to go and do some of the recording. And so there's a sleeve of an actual 78 that I bought. I've only recently discovered this movement, and I bought my first 78s just very, very, very recently. But you see some of the names of the artists on the slide. Maybe you've heard of Lawrence Welk, Billie Holiday, Gene Autry, Count Basie, some of the names listed on this. But it says there's three main genres of 78: popular, hillbilly, and race. And they don't use those terms, hillbilly and race, but that was country and blues. And today it's, country and R&B, hip hop, etc., right? So the musical genres were segregated, but the pop music was cool. But what was really cool was the rural music of the South. And so you had these song collectors and these song hunters going into your church and going into your, house party in your shack and ripping these discs to create the genres of hillbilly and the blues. And then when the hillbilly and the blues got married, with Chuck Berry, but the famous, of course, when white people started to sing like black people, when Elvis married country to the blues, that's when rock and roll was, of course, born. Also, I mentioned Chuck Berry. There's also Little Richard. There's also Bill Haley in the Comets, and there's so many, Buddy Holly, of course, so many others at the birth of rock and roll. And so we're going to learn today about two of my favorite song hunters of the 20th century. That was 100 years ago, coming up to the present day. But I also want to talk very briefly about kind of the revival, because first of all, a lot of the people into this are like old, middle-aged dudes, right? It seems to be a area of like obsessive record collecting is dominated by like old guys with like black plastic frame glasses like myself. And so the fact that there's some young hipsters that are getting into this, I think, is like really monumentally important here. So the slide shows Amanda Petrusic, and she's a more of a millennial than a Gen Xer like myself. You guys are what comes after millennial, Generation Zoom, Generation Z. The millennials are Generation Y. I was Generation X. They're going to need to start coming up with new letters after Z. But she's a millennial hipster who got into this, and she's a professional music writer. She writes for the New Yorker magazine. She's one of America's most famous record critics, and definitely one of their top female record critics, right up there with Ann Powers, who's my girl because she's Gen X and she's based out of Nashville, Tennessee, works for National Public Radio. And she wrote a book called The Wild Obsessive Hunt for the World's Rarest 78 RPM Records, also known as Do Not Sell at Any Price. And I read this book over my break, and it started to explain to me like the mystery, right? It's like going on an archaeological dig. So like in the 1940s, they found these ancient scrolls buried in a cave in the Middle East called the Nag Hammadi Library. And when they extracted these scrolls, it was like they were Bible scriptures of books in the Bible that weren't in the Bible. So they were non-canonical Bible scriptures, but they were Bible era texts, New Testament era texts on parchment in these little containers in a cave. And so these scrolls got unrolled and interpreted and then released to the public as the Nag Hammadi dig. And well, digging for records is like digging for ancient sacred texts buried in a cave. So digging for 78 records is very much like that. And not very many people are into it. Not that many people even have a device on which they can play it. Now, my store-bought cheapo, new turntable that I bought, my first turntable I bought before I got my old turntable from my parents, and then I bought a new, nicer turntable. But when I first started really getting back into vinyl again about 10 years ago, I bought just a cheapo turntable. It actually has a 78 setting on it, so I can, when I bring my 78s home now, I can at least listen to them at the house. And I got my first 78s in Decatur, Georgia, just a little while ago, about a month ago, half ago, at Wuxtree Records in Decatur, Georgia. Highly recommend that. And I'd been to Wuxtree once before, was completely blown away by their folk music section, because as my guest on the call understands, folk music has become to dominate my life. And so I went back to it because I wanted to dig in their folk section again. Found some great Guy Carawan discs. Guy Carawan wrote "We Shall Overcome," or he popularized "We Shall Overcome." Pete Seeger worked on it as well. Also, it had roots in traditional gospel. But Guy Carawan was a white folk singer who went to a place called Monteagle, Tennessee, up here on the mountain near Sewanee, to the former Highlander Folk School back in the 50s, where people like MLK and Rosa Parks and other civil rights workers went. And it was Miles Horton started it, and it was this integrated folk school. And Guy Carawan on his guitar taught everybody how to sing "We Shall Overcome" right here in Tennessee at Monteagle. So anyway, so as I'm in the folk section at Wuxtree over my break, I look around to the side, and then, of course, my mind is just completely blown, because right there in front of me is this huge wall of 78s, and they weren't organized like the rest of the records. I didn't know what I was doing, but I was like, I'm here for this. I'm going to start understanding this. And I went to the library yesterday. Of course, I didn't read all these books, but just to remind you, just like there's vinyl records, there's books too. Not everything is a Kindle download. And so I went and got some old books out of the tech library. And I found this one book by this guy, and I was reading about this other guy, Alan Lomax, that I'm going to tell you about. And I found out about this guy called Howard Odom. Howard Odom, PhD from the University of North Carolina, wrote this book, Chapel Hill. 1926 is the date stamp on this book. It's called The Negro Work Songs, and you know that they used to say that was the politically correct term when Professor Odom wrote this book in 1926. The term black became very popular in the 60s, and the term African American became very, very popular in the 1970s. If you have black folks in your life, you ask them how they prefer to be called. Now, I've been studying this for a long time. African American studies is one of my areas, but black seems to be preferred by a lot of folk as the proper term. And it was called the Black Lives Matter movement, not the African American Lives Matter movement. And that's particularly also in their tradition. A lot of folks don't identify as African Americans, who are the descendants of former enslaved persons. Seems to be more how they define themselves. And we have a lot of people who are immigrants from other parts of the diaspora who prefer the term black. But anyway, so Negro was a term that they used to use. And I'm going to read this straight as it was, the frontispiece from that book. It's partly on the slide there. It says, "A vast throng of Negro workaday singers, mirrors of a race, working men in the southern United States, from highway, construction camp, from railroad and farm, from city and countryside, 1 million strong, 500,000 migrants from the south, eastward, northward, westward, and some south again. Negro offenders in 1,000-fold in local jails, county chain gangs, state and federal prisons, a horde of southern casual laborers and wanderers down that lonesome road, a brown, black army of bad people, bad men, creepers and ramblers and jamboree breakers, traveling men deluxe, itinerant, full-handed musicianeers, music physicianers and songsters, singly in pairs, quartets, always moving on, a host of women workers from field and home and factory at once, singers and subjects of the lonesome blues, a swelling crescendo, a race vibrato, inimitable, descriptive index of group character, folk urge, and race power." So this is a very, I think, fairly, buttoned down white professor from North Carolina, Howard Odom, and he's obsessed with black culture. And he wrote a trilogy of novels called Black Ulysses, all in the voice of a black character, and written in his idea of, Ebonics kind of, and of the 20s. And nowadays, this stuff seems a little offensive. It seems a little bit like a cultural appropriation. And then there's going to be the whole problem about Lomax, about the ethics of what he was doing, which I'll address only briefly in the coming slides. But the thing that's just kind of mind-blowing about this is is at a time when the Ku Klux Klan was running and Jim Crow was running, you had these white professors who were just like completely blown away by black folk culture, and they thought this is what America is, and also white working class poor folk culture and church culture and blues culture. Now, remember on Monday, I put the blues and the gospel together, and then I put the blues and the gospel fighting against each other. And clearly, as I'm studying the work of Lomax and Harry Smith, these American song hunters, it is absolutely in concert. On these discs that you get, these sound archives put together by Harry Smith and Alan Lomax. I talked about the distance between Saturday night and Sunday morning. In Lomax and Smith, that distance has been completely collapsed because it's all America. It's all Americana. It is America changed through music. It is a land learning to listen to itself. And so you had the sinful, sordid, saucy blues lyrics, about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and just all bad, like that one poem said. I just read the bad people, the bad men. That was a bad man. Well, you got the bad man with the sanctified Holy Spirit preacher, Pentecostal revival meeting, throw down, get down, feel the Spirit, amen, hallelujah, pass the basket of chicken and chitlins right now, mixed in there together. It's all the same thing. It's all America. And see, this is, before the MP3 player, before MTV, before vinyl albums, 78s. These guys had two different methodologies for collecting. Harry Smith, my spiritual forebear, he's on the left of my slide, I guess. He's the guy with the glasses. He is working by collecting the 78s. And then Alan Lomax is being funded by the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and working with other professors and scholars. And he starts out because his dad, John Lomax, collected. He's going out collecting field recordings, and he's making records. He's literally cutting records out there in the field. Matter of fact, Alan Lomax, as much as I love Harry Smith, Alan Lomax is, in my estimation, why we can be the people we are as far as pop culture in America and rock and roll, and the debt that we owe to the blues and the gospel and to roots music. Without Alan Lomax, I don't even know where we'd be. One of my first exposures to this is through Greil Marcus, and Greil Marcus tries to connect the world of Bob Dylan to the world of Harry Smith, and Marcus makes famous this phrase, "the old weird America." He spins it off of the old free America. Now, my friend John Wright, who I just interviewed about this topic, he said it's not that old and it's not that weird. These are just popular records. But Bob Dylan's important, and if you haven't heard of him, that's okay. Now, we're going to be talking next week about Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg in their day in the 50s and 60s were massive celebrities. They were household names. Everybody knew who Kerouac and Ginsberg were. When I teach this class, most students have never heard of Kerouac and Ginsberg. Maybe they've heard of Dylan, but maybe you haven't heard of Dylan. Don't feel bad if you haven't heard of Dylan. But a couple of years ago, Bob Dylan, American songwriter from Minnesota, from BF, Minnesota, was given the Nobel Prize in Literature. And I felt the world move beneath my feet, Larry Nugent, the day that they gave the Nobel Prize in Literature to Bob freaking Dylan. This was a gigantic moment in all of everything that is beautiful and crazy about America. And so in this fantastic book, Greil Marcus is the Dean of Rock and Roll Studies in America. Greil Marcus also wrote a great book about the Sex Pistols, a punk band from England, and he's written so many other amazing books. But Marcus's Old Weird America, he connects Bob Dylan's legacy to Harry Smith's legacy, and why this songcraft and this song hunting and this song collecting is so much a part of what our theme for this class is this semester. Our theme, remember, I stole the line from a Simon and Garfunkel lyric from their song America. The theme of the whole semester is we are looking for America. One way we're going to learn about America is by listening to America. So can't get there without Bob Dylan. Harry Smith grew up in the Pacific Northwest. One of the things that Harry Smith did as a young person was work on airplanes. One of the things that Harry Smith did is he went and visited with Native American tribes, and he went and hung out with Native American tribes of the Pacific Northwest while they were having a peyote ceremony. If you don't know what peyote is, it's a psychotropic uh, plant that indigenous people will eat. There's elegant ways of saying this, but they would go on a trip, right? They would trip out, you know, and this is fairly mainstream now. There's psychedelic studies is having a renaissance. They've legalized psychedelic mushrooms in many parts of the United States. Marijuana is mostly getting legal. There's several highbrow clinical studies in the field of psychology, meditation, wellness studies, mental health studies, where the use of psychedelics is becoming completely mainstream again. Of course, it was considered very not mainstream for a long time, very kind of illegal, illicit, bad. Only bad people did psychedelics. But it's important to understand Harry Smith and in the realm of psychedelics. We'll be talking later on in the semester more about Dylan and another psychedelic American icon, the Grateful Dead, to understand that this is a whole repertoire of the counterculture. This will come up with Kerouac and Ginsberg next week as well. So Harry Smith as a young kid is going and making archival recordings, field recordings of Native Americans doing peyote ceremonies. Then he gets into film, and he's one of the first people that we know of that would take a strip of film. Now, you guys can go out and make a collage all different ways. You can make a collage digitally. You can make cut-ups with your scissors and your glue. Like, that's what I like to do. You can go around and collect images and photograph them on your phone. And you might even have a picture editor in your phone now that you can do weird stuff with it. You might be able to upload that to iMovie or some other DIY film program and just mash that together and make a movie, a very atmospheric movie. But back in the day, what Harry Smith did is he took a long roll of actual film and he painted on the film. He just painted pictures on the film, and then he'd let it dry, and then they'd watch the movies. And then he'd play some random music with the movies. This is very avant-garde, weird, kind of hippy-dippy, trippy stuff. And Smith is getting involved in all this stuff, you know, in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. He was there and he participated in the hippie movement. But Harry Smith was before the hippie movement. He was also into the American esoteric tradition. I mean, maybe you guys have heard of, you know, QAnon or like the Masons or conspiracy theories. They're definitely having a renaissance now. But back 100 years ago, lots of Americans, whether or not they were Christian, some of them were Christians, some of them weren't. They were into what has been called new religious movements or the occult, and they were just getting into like really weird stuff, right? And the power of the mind to experience itself differently, but also to apply itself to solicit particular outcomes, desired for outcomes. And that's really just the definition of magic. Magic is the manifestation of will. So Harry Smith was known as a magician. So he was a filmmaker, he was a magician. He also collected stuff. He collected paper airplanes, he collected eggs, he collected artwork of every variety, but he collected records. They say at one point his record collection numbered in around 10,000. And so of those old 78s. And so he was broke one day because apparently, as far as I can tell, Harry Smith was always broke, always depending on other people for a drink or a meal. And he just having a normal life never appealed to this guy. He was always on the margins of society. He was always, you know, that weird homeless guy talking to himself, you know, walking down the street, you know, in Rapture too. You know, sometimes you see those dudes on the street and you're like, this person needs help, right? This is very sad, it's very tragic. This person needs help, the neurodiverse. And then sometimes you see the crazy people on the street and you're like, he's having a good time. Just leave him alone. I imagine Harry Smith to be more that kind of an icon of Americana, where he was weird, he was mentally on another plane entirely from the rest of us, but he was okay. He was just going around doing his thing. I mean, this guy's a legend. He ended up getting a Grammy Award for this mixtape that I'm fixing to tell you about. And so at one point when he was broke, he cut a deal with Folkways Records out of the, you know, DC area, and this guy called Mo Ash, and they agreed to cut the Anthology of American Folk Music in 1952. And then he agreed to make a book about it, which is also called Liner Notes. And apparently there was all this, you know, there was 4 albums, 84 songs. It really corresponded with, you know, the 4 elements, you know, earth, water, fire, and air. Maybe it applied to the 4 seasons. You know, he had all this kind of spiritual woo-woo. But basically it was a collage. He took a bunch of songs, his favorites from all these different 78s, and he gave them an order and he arranged them into these categories, and he made the Anthology of American Folk Music. It came out in 1952, 84 songs. All the old 78s were culled from 1927 to 1932. This is the pre-Depression first heyday of recorded music. And there were other people like Alan Lomax. It wasn't just Alan Lomax and his dad, John Lomax. There was other people like them that were going into these rural communities trying to find music. And they were making music, cutting music, and basically discovering people, right? So people would come to your club, to your church, to your juke joint, and they would discover you, and they cut you a 78. Out of this, we get Robert Johnson. Out of this, we get so many greats. And so the genres are basically DIY, Americana, but basically blues, folk, country, and all other forms of American roots music. 27 to 32. 32 is when the Depression starts. And there becomes a real decline in the first wave of the recorded music boom. There's then a 1997 re-release, of course, it comes out on CD, and then there was a series of concerts of contemporary artists, people as famous as like Beck or Wilco, Nick Cave going and recording Harry Smith tracks from this anthology, from this mixtape, and then reinventing and reviving the Harry Smith tradition. The Smithsonian re-release from '97 sold out. They're going to re-release it again here in a minute. And then last year, some people got together and they decided to release the Harry Smith B-sides, which is this beautiful little box. And then inside this little box, there's a book. It's all about the book. And then there's a bunch of CDs. And this is from a label called Dust to Digital. And you can go on Spotify and you can look up Dust to Digital catalog. And there's a Spotify playlist that's like 1 million hours long of all the Dust to Digital releases. And it's all of this crazy archival folk music. So they started to see the Anthology of American Folk Music itself as a sacred text. I compared it to the Nag Hammadi scrolls. Larry and I were talking the other day. My friend who's on the call, who I'm going to give another shout out to here in a couple of minutes. And he said, like me, I'm really just recently getting heavily into Harry Smith, and he was like, it was like knowing, your whole life, that the Bible was out there, but never having read the Bible. I've been reading the Bible since I was a kid, been going to church on and off since I'm a kid. I'm a frustrated believer, a very theologically nomadic human being, but I love Jesus, and I'm definitely a sinner, so I like the idea of forgiveness. That's I can get with that. But my friend said, we were just talking about this yesterday. It was like you knew the Bible was there, but you never read, and then you open up the Bible. And I've met people who are adult converts. The first time they read the Bible, their mind is blown. It's just such an incredible book. Well, here you go, Harry Smith. The Harry Smith Anthology is kind of like a Rosetta Stone, they call it, a sacred text. It is a Bible for roots music buffs. And the phrase "America changed through music" was what Harry Smith's dream was. Harry Smith had a dream. America changed through music. They gave him the Grammy right before he died in 1990, early 1990s. Smith passed, this 30 years ago. This is a good time, the year of his passing, to be participating in the Harry Smith revival. So I'm not the only person out there. There's a lot of other people doing Harry Smith stuff right now. He's experiencing a renaissance, and that's a fantastic thing. I'm going to go just a little bit into some of the tracks that are on this stuff, but I want to tell you about these guys because they're just so incredible. So Alan Lomax is from Austin, Texas, and that alone just blows my mind, because Austin, Texas is definitely the Nashville of Texas. It's definitely the San Francisco of Texas. It's definitely one of the hubs of the outlaw music movement. So Austin, Texas is just so legendary. They had a huge punk scene in the 80s, definitely a huge songwriter scene. For years, they had a fantastic music conference called South by Southwest. I think it's temporarily on hiatus for another year, probably due to COVID. But so Alan Lomax is from Austin, Texas, and that just his credibility goes up just like, I'm from Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit, and I got some credibility to talk about some of the stuff I talk about because of my formative years in Detroit. I was told as I was traveling in the late 80s, people said, "You're from Detroit. You have instant badass status." Anybody? I mean, and I lived in Detroit. I lived in the Cass Corridor. I went to Wayne State University, rode my bike through the hood. You know, I lived it. I did it. I survived it, and it formed and shaped me. And I'm sure being from Austin, Texas, shaped a young Alan Lomax. He was known as a folklorist, an archivist, a writer, a scholar, activist, oral historian, and filmmaker. The Alan Lomax collection today, he passed away in 2002, so Harry Smith passed in 91, contains approximately 650 linear feet of manuscripts, 6,400 sound recordings, 5,500 graphic images, 6,000 moving images of ethnographic material created and collected by Alan Lomax and others during their work, documenting song, music, dance, and body movement. So he would literally get grants or beg money from patrons and go out into the field, and he would literally drive around America with notebooks and recording equipment, and he would go deep in there. And so I started looking at, he's got his own YouTube channel that I just discovered literally last night. I was getting ready for this lecture, and my mind is just, so he goes into these, you know, club in New Orleans, you know, during Mardi Gras. It is Mardi Gras season now for a couple more days. Got about 2 weeks left till Lent, and he's recording Mardi Gras Indians, you know, rehearsing, you know, a jam session of some Mardi Gras Indians singing Mardi Gras music. He goes into these old churches and all these different old white churches and old black churches. He's got a lot of the Sacred Harp shape note singers where it's this like polyphonic, where all the voices are working together to create this like cosmic sonic blah, just like Sacred Harp singing is like nothing you've ever heard. And then a lot of the call and response, African American singing, where you have one lead vocalist going with one track, you know, vocal, and then the congregation response singing. There's just this roots to it. And what the biographer of Lomax pulls out is this idea that, you know, a lot of what gets marketed to America as spirituals and as gospel is somewhat sanitized. And unfortunately, I love this organization. First of all, I love Nashville. I love everything about Nashville. And Fisk is a great HBCU in Nashville. And the Fisk Jubilee Singers, I mean, they're a giant in American musical history. But what the Lomax book is kind of insinuating is that groups like the Fisk Jubilee Singers had kind of sanitized this and watered it down and made it more palatable for a classic music audience, so they could go and sing in, you know, Carnegie Hall or whatever. But what the field recordings were doing was, according to this author, finding the eschatology of the inner ear, basically like the deep spirituality, the internal, you know, Bible spirituality, Holy Spirit, you know, feel it in your toes and in your bones, just a reverberating power in American folk roots culture of the church and the blues joint and the nightclub that in its early 20th century and late 19th century forms had a personal power that its later derivatives are getting back to. And that's why roots music and acoustic music and folk music are still so popular today. And even when I listen to rock and roll and I listen to pop, when I listen to a track, I know if it has that thing or it doesn't. Now, we know we like what we like, and I've trained my ears and my bones to like certain songs, but we know we like what we like. This roots music is the tap source. It is the, you know, the garden of earthly delights. It is it's the Atlantis. It's the fountain of eternal youth. It is the thing. It's that. It is a water and a spirit and a fire. It's a power, an elemental power of human spiritual convergence through song and lyric that makes life worth living. And Alan Lomax went around, drove around in a car to find this stuff. So I've been listening to this biography. I haven't finished it yet. And I literally, after I hung out with Larry yesterday, listening to the 78s, I had to message him, and I was like, I had no idea. One of the great 20th century Black American writers, and I've studied a lot of Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and Audre Lorde. There's a lot of Black female American writers. Octavia Butler will be doing later on in this semester. So I am well versed in African American literature and women's African American literature. Earlier, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin. But I've always known Zora Neale Hurston, but she's been kind of this enigma out there in the sideline for my studies, and I'm going to have to take a deeper look now because of this story is so mind blowing. So in 1935, in the peak of the Depression, for a couple of months, and Alan Lomax is only 20 and he's on summer break. Now, some of you do internships on summer break. Imagine this internship. You're 20, and you go on a car trip through Georgia and Florida, through down in Brunswick, Georgia, the Sea Islands, going down there towards Jekyll Island. You go to Hilton Head and you hang a right, okay? And you get into that kind of murky, swampy Georgia coastal area right there. So, and they go all the way down to Florida. So it's one car, one recording device. And it's Alan Lomax. And Alan Lomax is allegedly in charge of this through the Library of Congress. And he's 20, and two women, at the time they were both 40, a Black woman and a white woman, the three of them traveling together. They're both in the 40s. Now, the way that he writes it, it sounds like, and he beats around the bush, and I'll probably do some more research on this to see if there's anything to this, but it seems like Mary Barnacle, who was an English professor and a left-wing activist, and Zora Neale Hurston, both kind of fancied young Alan Lomax. Now, I don't know how much they fancied him, and I'm not sure how much drinking and partying went on this trip, but they would go into these communities and they'd basically say, and Zora being Black, she would make the inroads into the Black community, and she'd basically say, hey, we're here, and we've got this recording device, come tell us your stories and songs. And people would come to them and make up stories and songs. And then they go into this one town, and Zora convinces Mary Elizabeth and Alan to do blackface. Well, that's totally offensive and weird, and they don't want to do it. They're like, hey, this is weird, and isn't this wrong? You know, and she says, I'm not having you do this for the Black people. I'm having you do this for the white people so we don't get arrested. Well, it turns out Alan ends up getting arrested just for being in this interracial research tour, in the South in 1935. But that was his summer internship at 20 years old. And these women are like fierce intellectuals, like very opinionated. And there's letters that I was able to dig up of Zora Neale Hurston writing letters to Alan's dad, John, basically cutting a pass against Mary Elizabeth. And it has to do with Mary Elizabeth's just a communist, and she wants Alan to be a communist. Well, Alan, because he studied this music, will become a true civil rights activist. And so he will embrace a more, socialist, populist vibe, which is the union organizing, making sure that everybody has an equal share of the pie, and definitely a supporter of integration and of civil rights. I mean, because he's doing this is 20 years before the Montgomery bus boycott. A 20-year-old Alan Lomax from Austin, Texas, driving around the South with Zora Neale Hurston. It sounded like a wild summer internship, if there ever was one. So some of the iconic tracks that you're going to hear in some of these recordings by Alan Lomax and Harry Smith, it can be the Carter family. And so the Carter family, of course, is Mother Carter, whose daughter, June Carter, ends up marrying Johnny Cash. And you've seen Walk the Line, some of you, and so you know how important this story is to Americana, the marriage of Johnny Cash and of June Carter. And then their descendants, are among us today. Johnny and June's descendants are among us today, still doing great things. But this is like the birth of country music, and it's the birth of like really good root gospel from the white community. And they're very, very faith. They're very authentic in their faith, and they very much want this to be a, kind of a morally enriching experience. This is not the juke joint. This is Sunday morning music, not Saturday night music. But the Carter family, they just know how to sing and play. And so the Carter family tracks, the early tracks, are iconic for this period, and they're going to show up both in Alan Lomax's and Harry Smith's mixtapes, if you will. And then they discovered Leadbelly, and I'm still trying to unpack this legend, because part of what's going on with Leadbelly is they're actually going into the prisons where he's incarcerated, making records, going out, and then these records end up selling and stuff, but Leadbelly's still up in the joint. And so there's this kind of like real ethical issue that you start to understand. And I'm not going to have time to unpack that this morning, but just keep in mind that Alan is getting all of these recordings, and that's a good thing. And the recordings are amplifying these stories and these cultures, which is a good thing. And it's promoting equality and diversity and joy, American joy, out of the sorrows of hardship. But no one's getting paid. No musicians are getting paid. So I joked last night to Larry that Alan Lomax is like a human Spotify. You know, he's popularizing all this music, giving it all this great exposure, but ain't nobody getting no scratch for it. There's no skin in the game. So the legends about Leadbelly are enormous. I'm still trying to learn more about him, but I'm starting to run out of time, and so I just want to tell you all that this movement of alternative music in America has many different places that it's cropped back up again. When I was a young kid, Athens, Georgia, in the South was considered to be like the place for new alternative Southern rock. First of all, the Allman Brothers Band, who are the '70s Southern rock giants, they come from Macon, Georgia. But over there in Athens, Georgia, you have REM and the B-52s, and you just have this huge movement, blossoming there. But I want to help uncover the secret history of Cookeville, the old weird Cookeville. I did a project about 5 years ago on the hippies of the 1960s, the Christian hippies at the Wesley Foundation. If you know about the Wesley Foundation, it's right there next to campus on 9th Street, across the street from College Side. So I wrote a whole paper on the hippies of the Wesley Foundation. But I think I'm going to do a new project with my friend Larry, pictured here. He's the guy that had the '78 Victrola crank-up machine that I got into yesterday. And while I was at his workspace, I started finding all these posters. That's a hatch print. Hatch prints are legendary rock posters out of Nashville, Tennessee, for a show by a band called Ferguson's Blue, Friday, January 15th. That's around like 97 or 98. And that's at the Magic Bean, which was right by the Farmers Market, right by Leslie Town Center, right by 1 Hour Martinizing, right by the Cookeville Performing Arts Center, right there. If you go south on Naylor, past the yoga studio, you're going to see it's like a little like off-white, grayish looking building, very plain looking now, some painted over. That was the 90s. That was the 90s center of the cool, of keeping Cookeville cool, of keeping Cookeville weird. Larry and I are going to work on a project. He's already put a lot of this out there on his own personal Facebook, but I'm going to help him document it some more, get more pictures of these old flyers, make a mixtape based on some of the artists that used to play there, and we'll drop that later in the year on Teacher on the Radio. But there is kind of a roots revival scene that's really famous here in Cookeville. There's the Hippie Jacks Festival, which I sadly have never been to, but also the Muddy Roots Festival is probably one of the most famous roots music festivals in the world. It's based right here in Cookeville. I've always been scared to go because I was afraid of I was afraid some rockabilly guy was gonna, get drunk and beat me up in his tent for being too much of a hippie. But I think I maybe misread Muddy Roots. Larry will disabuse me of those notions. We're looking for America this week. We're getting ready to learn more about our own playlist assignment. I'm going to actually drop the playlist assignment on Friday, so you guys can be working on it all semester. It won't be due till the end of the semester in April. And we have now wasted another 50 minutes with Mr. Smith. And so thank you all for attending American 2130 today to learn about American song hunters, Harry Smith and Alan Lomax. Let's keep looking for America, and I'll see you on Friday.